Hi everybody and welcome to this week's Viking Chat. Delighted this week to be joined by Tim Frome of Hamilton Fraser. For those of you who aren't aware of Tim or what Hamilton Fraser is, Tim, tell us a bit more.
Morning, Kristjan. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me on today. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, so Hamilton Fraser are a scheme administrator business, basically, and we run the My Deposits tenancy deposit protection scheme.
Yeah.
We run the Property Redress scheme, and we run Client Money Protect. So we have differing services for agents across three different bits of government legislation.
And some pretty critical touch points there,
exactly,
right?
yes.
I mean, no agents getting around those. Obviously, CMP, legally required for letting agents.
Yep.
Property redress, legally required for all estate agents.
Yep.
And tenancy deposits, again, if you're touching tenant cash deposits, got to be using
protected.
one of you guys. So thanks for coming in today. So obviously that's a pretty broad spectrum. Ahead of this, you shared with me your guys' latest report, which covers a mixture of data analytics from you guys, insights that you've drawn, as well as surveys that you guys have conducted. Some interesting stuff. I've got notes here. There's no way I wrote down 5 pages of notes.
We might have to have a link to the report in the...
So I hope you've got nothing else to do today, Tim, because you're locked in for the rest of the day. No, we're still going to try and capture this in our kind of 45 minutes to an hour. But there's some really interesting bits that I want to pick up on. But let's start off with, tell us a little bit about this report. I mean, obviously I've touched on it in the vaguest of terms.
So the Property Redress Scheme, we have a requirement to produce an annual report, and we have a goal really to try and get out as early in the year as possible. So obviously it was in March we got it out for 2024, and the purpose of the report is to give an overview on all of our work really.
And this report's available
on the website. Yeah, on the website we use actually some pretty trendy technology called Turtle to put it together. So
I just have to say, going through it, it's a really nice, it's not your boring kind of PDF, like it was quite a nice little navigation, some little graphics in it, so definitely not your average boring.
No, got some polls, got some questions, got some case studies. So yeah, it's a nice report, it's well presented. It has developed over the years, shall we say. We started off with more of a dull kind of PDF type document, but we've developed as we've
And is that report available on like your individual schemes, or is it via the Hamilton Fraser website itself?
If you go onto the Property Redress website, just type Property Redress into Google or whatever, and it'll come up, and it's on the resources section, so just click in resources and it pops up there. Great. But so it gives just a lie of the land really for how we're doing, what we've been up to, and what kind of achievements we've had over the last year. So
there's a little bit of sales data in there because obviously your ombudsman work, but I think it's fair to say the vast majority of insights relate to the lettings industry. Because obviously client money protection and deposit scheme obviously all focuses into that, and obviously alongside that you guys also operate your own deposit alternative and are involved in that space as well. So there is a little bit of sales data, but it's purpose of today, and given tapping the microphone, given my wheelhouse, we'll focus very much on some of the lettings data that came out of it.
Makes sense. So we start with our membership stats within there, so you can see we keep growing as a scheme. Another 7% increase, I think it was in 2024. So we're now touching just over 19,000 individual agents across the country.
I found it quite interesting that about a third of your membership, I think it was about 35%, is London.
Yeah, massive amount in London. So
which I found, I don't know why that surprised me.
Yeah.
But I didn't expect it to be that dominant, but interesting.
It is what it is. Yeah. So we have a huge percentage in London. It's basically the majority of it is based around the cities, let's be honest. So that's where the vast majority of lettings work takes place. Up to just over 19,000. We've got an aim to get that to 20,000 obviously this year. Nice round number. But with the branches as well, we are well over 20,000 now. So that's showing the growth in the scheme over the last 10 years.
Because are you the biggest redress scheme?
We are now. There's obviously
because I believe there's about
there's different ways you can cut cut the cake. So
but there's about, I mean, in my understanding is that there's roughly 24,000 branches.
Well, our stats would suggest that there's a lot more than that when you add us with the Property Ombudsman's stats as well. But we have nearly, of that 19,000 individual agents, well over half of them are doing lettings. So that shows that the number that we've got there. That they then do sales as well, property management. We have some property professionals as well. So these are company landlords. So a lot of company landlords actually act as agents. So they look like an agent if you just saw them on the high street. Yeah. Particularly you kind of build to rent type operators. So they, even if it's not a mandatory requirement to join, they like to join anyway. So they're offering a good service. But then we have all kinds of other people. So we have inventory clerks. So a lot of inventory clerks join us.
And look, I think the build to rent thing, they're just kind of getting ahead of it, right? Because we know Renters' Rights Bill,
it's coming.
Ombudsman membership is going to come in as part of that, which it should do. We've always felt very strongly that was an imbalance that agents were held to an ombudsman and landlords weren't, particularly when, and we might touch on this later with some of the stats, particularly when ultimately it's landlords that have the final say in maintenance and upkeep.
Yeah, it is a bit of an issue that we see in terms of the fact there's a loophole there that the agent is held to a standard. The agent is required to communicate and deal with things properly, but it can fall a little bit over the cliff, shall we say, when they've done everything they're supposed to, the agent, but it's the landlord that's not playing ball.
Well, I mean, I was going to come to that later. So you've actually got, that's one of your case studies in the report, is... So a lot of agents will identify this. So it was a maintenance issue reported by the tenant. Agent claims to have reported it to the landlord. Landlord apparently was either unwilling or totally unresponsive to do the works. Works didn't get done. Tenant felt unfairly treated. Raised a complaint which escalated to you guys, and I think I'm right in saying they got awarded £200 for the inconvenience. Now, the interesting one in there was that you did award a fairly nominal compensation to the tenant, and it didn't go into the details, but it kind of reading between the lines of the case study, it didn't sound like it was major property issues, just frustrating ones that began very early on in the tenancy. But interesting, the award was primarily given, was awarded against the agent, not because it wasn't fixed, because that wasn't their fault, but because they hadn't carried out and recorded good enough communication. And I think that is a repeating theme that comes throughout the report, is communication often sits at the root of why things go wrong.
Basically. It's good to talk, basically.
It is good to talk. It's good to talk. And so that one, I think the agent claimed to have notified the landlord, but couldn't evidence that. They also hadn't updated the tenant. And again, this is something that's really, really important. And some agents make this mistake. And I'm actually going to include this based on experience my sister has had of recent trying to sell a property. Touching on the sales side, communication and updating people is really important, even if you've got nothing to update them.
Basically,
I think some people forget that telling someone that nothing's changed is still telling someone
it's having
that they haven't been forgotten, that it is still being pursued. Sometimes just telling someone that nothing's happened is still a really important part of the process. Right, so we've jumped ahead there. So I'm gonna, like I said, I've got 3 million notes. We're gonna see what we can crack through here. So. Some interesting ones. So there was a 20% increase in complaints up on the year before, which in total was a 44% increase on 2 years prior.
That's right.
Now, do you think that is service getting better? Because, like, personally, I feel that this is driven by one of two things. An increased awareness by tenants of ombudsman schemes, of complaints process, a better understanding of what their rights are and how to enforce them. So whilst some may use that statistic to highlight a falling in standards in the sector, I think my view, and I'd be interested to hear what yours is that what I see is a constantly improving sector, but part of that improvement is a better framework, better protection, more information out there, and like I said, tenants better understanding their rights and responsibilities. But despite the increase, the 20% increase on last year, your early resolutions, which is where you guys do a kind of pre-adjudication, a sort of ADR service before it goes full guns blazing, was actually down substantially. The actual amount awarded was down 45%. So what I gather from that is potentially more things are being reported, but they're potentially less serious.
Well, the amount of money that we awarded at early resolution. Interestingly, if the amount of money is down, that's not due to increase in amount of early resolutions being done, because of all the cases that we deal with, around 55% of them were actually resolved through some form of early resolution last year. So what that means is that the guys, the case assessors that we have, are getting on the phone to the parties, so they're speaking to the person who's complaining in the first place, just to get a real understanding of what the matter is, and then they're speaking to the agent and explaining what the issue is, and really sometimes cutting away from the noise and the nonsense and actually finding what the crux of the issue is and getting that resolved. And if you can get that resolved, that makes the rest of the complaint go away.
Yes, I mean, that was a really interesting thing. That was in the report that, you guys do kind of ADR over half of the complaints, and that is literally just about your team picking up the phone, having a chat with the agent or landlord, having a chat with the tenant, gathering your evidence, and making a decision. But I just thought that was interesting given the increase, but the decrease in total. So what we're saying is potentially part of that is the enhanced skills of your team. But I think also that reflects that potentially there are less serious issues being escalated. However, on the flip side, the default decisions, so the ones that don't get resolved in ADR and go on to the kind of full adjudication. That was substantially up. So that had increased from 950,000 up to 1.5 million. I am rounding off quite a lot of the figures in the report. There were some very precise figures, but I'm rounding them off just make them a little bit more digestible. So interestingly, what I kind of read from that is there is a split. More tenants are more aware, more things are being reported, but a mixture of more serious things and less serious things.
Exactly. So the more serious issues we see are when obviously there's a higher level of compensation being requested by the complainant. And the main thing that we saw last year, the one area of work which has really increased the amount of the awards when it goes to decision, is in the sourcing space.
In the sourcing space?
So
can you expand on that a bit more?
Talk about that. So basically there's an industry, shall we say, within, and there's actually quite a lot of it is in the southeast and around London, whereby companies provide a service to either investors or current landlords already, whereby they will try and find property for them to then either buy it for them, or they will request a certain amount of money to invest in a scheme, shall we call it, which buys a property, and then they will then rent the property out on behalf of the investors.
So really what we're talking about is this sort of flood of property experts that we see across an array of social media channels. Okay.
So, and interesting, within our scheme, we see the majority of these ones come into us, I think.
Interesting.
So what happens then is, if the service is not up to scratch, shall we say, so the person puts the money down, so they put a deposit down in the first instance, the property sourcer says they're going to find a suitable property, they then do not find a suitable property, or the property is not to the standard, or they do not then actually manage to fill the property and pay the yield that they say they're going to, that's when the consumer has an issue. And then we're talking real sort of serious consumer law matters here, and that's when the awards are of the higher amount.
That's really interesting to know, and that interestingly, that did not come across from the report. So it'd be really interesting to kind of see and hear a bit more of that, because I think thinking about how the agency industry is perceived, we're always having this battle with public perception. And look, we all know there is an element of our industry that is always going to bring that kind of disrepute. But I think what's interesting is that the perception from the report, again, looking at the increase of claims being made and the increase of the default decisions, there is a suggestion that landlords and agents, because that's kind of the presumption that this is mainly what this is about, is the driver of that. So it's really interesting to hear about that, and it'd be interesting to kind of hear Hamilton Fraser, obviously outside of this, kind of expand on that a bit more, because there's a lot of talk about a lot of these kind of get rich quick, you know, I'll tell you how I made million, like property experts who often the only money they make is selling courses about the money that they never made. So
exactly. And on that basis, actually, the way that the report is designed, it's an interactive document, so we can actually take feedback from industry and update it as we're going along if there's specific questions about our stats. So that's actually something I can take back, and we can look at whether we can actually add something into the complaint stats about like a focus on sourcing. And we can pull out from the stats exactly how much of that was related to sourcing type complaints.
Just be really interesting, and also it sounds like, and given your explanation, it doesn't surprise me that quite a lot of your bigger awards related to that, because it sounds like it's a bigger financial transaction than your typical kind of tenant paying rent.
And that's the point. There's only so much you can really award in the standard tenancy type issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
right.
You're dealing with, you're doing it all day, every day, so you know. But there's only so much that can go wrong, shall we say, that would result in a payment. If we're looking at rent, that's slightly differently. So, say for example, an agent is not passing on rent for some reason. Obviously, we can be the first port of call for the landlord to complain, and we'll look into it. And if we can see that something's gone wrong, we can make an award. What that generally means is that the agent is on the way out. So we're like the first port of call before that agent goes out of business, and that's when potentially the CMP scheme will come into play.
And then, out of interest, when you kind of have those red flags around a business, are there any kind of protocols or steps you guys take in
We have a compliance team, obviously, so our compliance team are very switched on.
And we'll kind of zero in on that business.
So we have Chinese walls, obviously, so the schemes are separated, but the guys all know each other. They've all come through various different parts of the business, so they're naturally going to discuss. But then we do actually have some memorandums of understanding with other government authorised schemes when it comes to removing people from the scheme. So if we remove an agent from the property redress scheme, we will tell the property ombudsman, and vice versa, because that agency cannot join the other scheme if they're removed from our scheme while there's a live complaint. So that's actually, although we're not regulators and we're not, we don't have any specific enforcement powers ourselves, that acts as a really good kind of gatekeeper to be able to.
And I'm always slightly
to make the agents actually comply with the decisions if they want to carry on trading.
So obviously there was a stat on that has increased. So you could give a slightly worrying interpretation that expelled agents has increased 40% or thereabouts, which sounds terrifying. But I think actually then when we talk in context, that number went from 58 expelled agents the previous year up to 76 expelled agents, which if we're looking at the size of sector, that's still a small number, fundamentally.
And this is where statistics can be, they can look scary, but when you look at the actual, the core numbers, it's not in the grand scheme that big a deal. And then also when you look at the type of agencies that we've removed, a number of those will be this sourcing business rather than your day-to-day lettings. Or
again, it'd be really, I think that would be something really interesting to kind of clarify out in that report. Be good to understand, because like I said, I've literally written down here agents against those statistics. So because obviously landlords aren't included yet in that legislation. So my assumption was that's all agents. So that would be really interesting to kind of understand that. So looking at the common areas of complaint, I mean, I don't think there was any shockers there. I mean, for lettings and management, it came down to poor service. Specifically lettings, it's centred around holding deposits, payments, and rent collection.
Yeah.
And then for standalone property management, it was maintenance. And actually, the other one that I found surprising was provision of documents.
Yeah.
I mean, given how vital most of those documents are in either complying with existing regulation or being able to enforce the content of those documents, that one surprised me.
We have seen it's record keeping, and document provision is a common issue because, again, as you know, if you're working in a busy office, you've got a lot of different compliance requirements you have to keep to for every single property. Things do slip through the net every now and again, and that's generally what we see. So an EPC might be missed, gas safety might be missed, a check-in or a check-out report was not done, a mid-term inspection. So
which kind of ties into some other stats.
Yeah, it could be any number of these documents. Is something that the landlord this would generally be a landlord complaint. So the landlord would be requesting this from the agent. Did they do it? They're expected to do it as part of their management service. Wasn't done. Complain to us. We'll have a look. Ask the agent.
Interestingly, because where you've got those in the report, it's actually a graphic. So you've got a kind of symbol, and it's, these are the kind of the three most common things. I mean, again, if we're touching on things in the report, it would be really interesting to understand with those common issues, which ones of those are more agent related and which one of those are more landlord related. Because that's really interesting that you say about the provision of documents, which I think really aligns with what we know about general knowledge and understanding about regulatory compliance, and the fact that that is typically more challenging for a landlord than it is for a letting agent. I mean, again, just another little feedback for you guys. Be good to understand from those whether there is a lean towards it being agent-led or landlord-led in terms of the cause of the issue.
Well, it's generally be the landlord that's complaining against the agent because they haven't been provided with a document that the agent is expected.
Okay. I misunderstood what you said. So I thought you meant the tenant was complaining because the landlord hadn't provided them.
Generally, the tenants, generally the tenants aren't too clued up, shall we say, on all of the documents that they're supposed to.
No, and we'll touch on some of that in a bit.
It's only when you come to a possession proceeding, maybe, that they suddenly do their research and realise all the
good
different
old
things
ChatGPT.
the different things that they should have been served with either at the beginning or during the tenancy.
So I'm gonna skip on to some other bits. So you did a sector survey, which was interestingly mainly landlord and tenant responses. It was about 95% landlords and tenants, and only about 5% agents. So make of that what you will.
I think that possibly the reason for that is we use the My Deposits database to be able to send that survey out. And when we're looking at just pure numbers, we've got sort of 350,000 landlords on the books.
It's quite a few.
Through My Deposits.
That's quite a few.
We're talking the 20-odd thousand agents. So I guess statistically from a numbers point of view, and it does get sent out to the tenants as well. So we've also got email addresses for tenants through My Deposits as well. So although the figures and the stats and we've reported on the survey through Property Redress because it's the most easy way to do it with our annual report, the majority of our touch points within the industry comes from our massive My Deposits database.
So, I mean, there's a lot of stats in here. A lot of these weren't particularly surprising. 76% of agents feel overwhelmed by regulatory charges. Don't think that's any surprise right now. Most agents are just
a bit worse in the next.
Well, exactly. Most agents are just wrapping their heads around implementing everything around HFIS, and obviously we've got that tiny little thing called the Renters' Rights Bill coming down the line. 73.5% feel less supported by government. Again, I don't think that's particularly surprising for a Labour government. They had been very clear on their focus was on strengthening tenant rights and strengthening how tenants sit within the PRS. I don't think that's a surprise. 66% believe the Renters' Rights Bill will negatively impact their business. I think that's an interesting one. I feel like in my conversations with agents, the tide is very much turning in that. And I think a very big agent I spoke to the other day, who I won't mention, but one of the UK's largest agents was talking to their MD, and he actually equated this, and in a much more positive way, to the tenant fee ban.
Yep.
He said actually, for them as a business, the tenant fee ban was much more terrifying because that was literally banknotes. That was, this is what we make out of that. That was a big figure in the big business.
Yeah.
And he said, we at the time, we talked about the cliff edge of impact.
Yeah.
And it was really a kind of cross your fingers, suck it and see, hope we've got this one figured out. And all of us, shock and horror, all of us have navigated out of it, which is absolutely fine. But I think interestingly, his attitude was, yes, look, there's a lot of changes coming in the Renters' Rights Bill, but from a business perspective, that's fine. We've got everything kind of prepped, ready to go, ready to kind of obviously be tweaked according with whatever final refinements there are.
Yeah.
But the general consensus that I hear with the people heavily involved with this at the highest levels is that 99% of the main framework isn't going to change.
No, not
it's thereabouts. The big juicy bits of what's been proposed. There might be some amendments to exactly what and how they work, but the expectation is the big elements of the Renters' Rights Bill are going to stay they are.
Well, I heard an interesting one actually just this week, which is going to be something that will apparently need a bit further consultation, which might not even get passed as part of the Renters' Rights Bill, and that's around the pet deposit. So have you heard? So that's a big issue. What they're talking about now is that the government is seriously considering increasing the deposit rather than making the tenant go down the insurance route.
Well, I think it's an interesting move because again, we covered this a lot recently at the Zoopla Lettings Advisory Board, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's a panel of I think about 12 of us, of agents big and small from up and down the country, and a handful of suppliers coming together quarterly to talk about challenges and opportunities within the sector and how that's going to change. So I've totally lost my train of thought on that one.
So pet deposits.
What we do about
pet deposits.
Well done, me. So no, interestingly touched on there, they said one of the biggest challenges at the moment is there isn't really an insurance provider. There isn't a suitable product in the space.
That's exactly what
and no insurance provider really wants to touch it because the liability and claim right is expected to be particularly high. So
until you've got some data, the insurers are generally quite cautious.
I mean, I think what the industry will love, right, is when the tenant fee ban came in and deposits were capped. The industry was very, very clear on permitted exemptions to the cap, and pets was a very clear exemption to that, and it wasn't granted, which typically resulted in tenants with pets paying higher rent. So actually incurring a material cost.
Did you see that recent story about the MP?
No, what was that one?
I'll put that on LinkedIn. So one of the, I think it's the Labour MP, she is renting a property in London, obviously because she's based in a constituency outside of London, and she put on her expenses pet rent.
Yes.
Pet rent was something that she claimed on her expenses. And this, obviously, if it wasn't specifically categorised, it had just been rent for a London property, nobody would have batted an eyelid. But because it was actually categorised as pet rent, obviously some eyebrows were raised and it became a bit of a story. So I found that quite interesting because we generally don't see too much about extra rent being charged for pets. I don't know whether
it's not massively. I mean, typically, our attitude is for our agency. It's not a massive. It's quite a small part of our portfolio. Tenants with pets is for us is not a big number. I'm sure in rural areas that will be considerably different, but in a city which is predominantly flat-led as well, with no outside space, the common thing is that pets don't play a big issue. But when we do get approached by people with pets, look, I mean, our conversation with the landlord, we kind of look at what pet it is and certain criteria. Like, for example, if it's a furnished flat and it's cats, we always kind of flag a concern over possibly them clawing. You know, that's really common. Obviously, you know, with any pet, you've got considerations about fleas and stuff like that. And then obviously if it's a dog, if it's a big dog, looking at things like, have you got like natural wood floors that they might scratch or things like that. But generally our consensus is to a landlord, look, the tenancy agreement protects you, the inventory and checkout report protects you, and that's what your deposit is there for. And the deposit, as we all know, doesn't cap a tenant's liability. So, you know, if you are in a situation, and let's face it, it's rare, where dilapidations exceed the deposit amount. It's definitely the exception, not the norm. You know, you've still got the ability to pursue the tenant for that. So, with the exception of possibly the most extreme cases. But, you know, I think that's you know, we could...
As you say, generally, if there's like a really serious issue in the property, the pet is only a small part of it. It's not going to be the pet itself which causes really the whole...
No, exactly.
When you have a breakdown to that level. That's interesting, actually. So with the depository, in terms of how you categorise the end of tenancy negotiations, dilapidations, do you have pet damage as a drop down?
We don't. So I think we've got cleaning, maintenance, gardening, rent, and other. I think it's those kind of 5 categories. But it'd be interesting. I think with the pet legislation coming with the Renters' Rights Bill, it might be interesting to create that so we can track that more going forward. Now, another one stat that came out, which slightly surprised me, because some content I've seen around this recently seems to be that the attitude towards this is changing, and that is concerns around Section 21 going. So your report highlighted 68.5% are concerned about Section 21 going. See, I find this an interesting one, because I've actually considered that one of the least important parts of what's being proposed, in terms of when you... I think it's important for fringe cases. But I think that's where the impact is of the greatest. Where you look at the vast majority of how the PRS functions, you know, around 85% of all tenancies are ended by tenants. You know, for a variety of reasons. Again, you guys touched on it in the report, the most common of which being job moving. Then I think it was like change of life circumstances, so splitting up, getting together, having kids, whatever that is, you know, and then a litany of other issues. But when you look at the key drivers of why a tenant moves or why a landlord brings a tenancy to an end, almost all of those provisions are catered for within. There are increased notice periods, and you've got caveats, like if you want to sell a tenanted property, it's 4 months notice, and if it stays as it is, you can't relet that property for a year. You know, so there are certain damaging frameworks, but I think, again, that's no bad thing. It's to bring security to tenants and make them feel more secure in their home. Again, you know, there are those landlords out there who try popping their property on the market almost annually to kind of test the market without any consideration of what it's like for the tenant having an agent and their viewers schlep through the flat over a 1, 2, 3 month period. But fundamentally, I think, you know, my attitude with the Section 21 rule from very early stage was, okay, it's changing, you know, and there are people who will be impacted. And I think the one I highlighted, the one that concerned me the most, and really looking at it from a Renters' Rights Bill viewpoint, i.e. that this legislation is meant to improve things for renters. I think unilaterally, one of the concerns for the industry, combined with the fact we've got indefinite tenancy agreements coming in, are tenants who sit on the fringes of acceptability, and for whatever reason that is, whether that's income / affordability, security of that income, you know, gig workers, you know, whatever that, you know, historical issues, whatever it is that causes the long-term viability of a tenant to be questioned for legitimate reasons by a landlord or letting agent, where landlords and agents might be willing to take a punt on someone.
Yeah. Because they know it's for a fixed
because they always knew, right, I've only got to guarantee you 6 months, and I've got the Section 21, so if I get worried, really, after the first couple of months, I can serve that and at least start the process for 6 months. And it didn't indemnify you from issues, because again, we all know, like, if that tenant refuses to move out, you're still lucky to get in front of a judge within 6 months in most parts of the country. Some parts of the country you'd be lucky if that's a year. But, you know, the unfortunate thing is some people would take a punt on that where tenants wouldn't meet standard criteria. And they'd go, do you know what? I've got a good feeling about you. Let's make this work. I think the unfortunate reality of that is that those people who sit on the fringes, most landlords and letting agents now, it just won't be an acceptable risk. No. And I think you're going to see a hardening of position about, you know, again, with indefinite tenancies, I think you're going to see an increasing number of letting agencies and landlords saying, well, unless you have a UK guarantor, a professional guarantor service, or you meet the criteria for a rent and legal expenses warranty. Unless we can have one of those three things in security, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some agents even require more than one of those. I'm sorry, but we just can't rent to you. And so, I think there is going to be a squeezed margin. And I think, again, we know Section 8 processes are more convoluted. As an industry, we know there is a narrative around Section 21 and this no-fault eviction label it's been given. But we also know that's a bit of a misnomer because
there's always a reason.
There are no landlords in the universe, and there are no agents in this universe who serve a Section 21 and kick a tenant out for no reason at all. It might be a selfish reason that they feel they can get more rent, or, you know, whatever it is, or they just find the tenant is really hard to deal with for whatever reason. But largely, there is a driver under that. The landlord needs to sell, which is covered, needs to move back in, which is covered. Rent increases can still happen, and lack of affordability is another common reason. So the core, I found it interesting that your report showed that statistic quite high, but it depends when that data was gathered, because I think in recent months, there's definitely a sign that was what caught everyone's attention, because that was what the likes of Shelter and Acorn and the media kind of ran first with. That's what the Conservatives obviously got ascension. We got that in the Queen's speech back in 2019, I think it was, that was going to happen.
It was in their manifesto. It was in the
manifesto.
Wherever the last Conservative victory was.
Which but the interesting thing, just one thing. Okay, I don't want to make this political, but I think one interesting thing, just coming back to that thing of landlords and agents feeling that the current government supports them less, and I kind of get that with the Renters' Rights Bill. But what I find interesting, and this is where surveys obviously leave these kind of gaps that you don't really know. You know, when we look at what the Tories implemented, I mean, they implemented Section 24, which I would argue is the most damaging piece of legislation to hit the PRS. And, you know, for those who don't understand Section 24, that is how your rental income is taxed when you're a private individual. It doesn't apply to limited companies, which the implementation of the law has seen a lot of landlords, new and existing, migrate across. So you could argue that not only has it caused damage, it's a very weird piece of legislation because the professional landlords in the sector have just navigated around it. So the additional income it generated is radically decreasing. But then it makes accidental landlords, who make up a big part of the market and are an essential part of the market, you know, really, really difficult. You know, and being taxed on your income rather than your profit in any business sector is bonkers. So I find, and let's also not forget that it was the Conservatives that started the Renters' Rights Bill. Now the Renters' Reform Bill with Labour, but again, they started this whole process. Yeah. They did a very drawn out handling of the method, and they drew to can it.
Yeah, if they moved a bit quicker, if they got their version of it passed.
And this was the thing, I think, as an industry, we all knew that from a landlord and tenant perspective, and again, there's an argument that when you're talking about a renters orientated piece of legislation, maybe that shouldn't be the driver, but hey, I'm an agent. Yeah. And obviously we work and represent with landlords. So I think, the general consensus was that the framework of changing is the core elements are still very much there, but it's kind of just been amped up with Labour, which we all knew. So I find it interesting that, and I think, yes, I agree, there is a less agent and landlord centric approach with this government, but picking up the mantle of renters' rights or renters' reform bill, that was always going to be the general consensus with that. But I do think that stat interesting, kind of ignores the fact that, it was the Conservatives that implemented the tenant fee ban, it was the Conservatives that implemented Section 24, it was the Conservatives that started the Renters' Rights Bill. So, there's not a brilliant legacy for our sector left by the previous party.
And interestingly, from the Tory loyal vote, they were all very unpopular policies.
Yeah.
Within their own party. But I think there's a bit of a nuance with the Section 20, getting rid of Section 21, which maybe landlords didn't even realise when they are saying that it's not something that they see as a positive, and that is around the rent increases. And yes, they are going to be able to propose a rent increase once a year, which is something that they can do anyway already under Section 13.
Yeah.
And any periodic tenancy, but, and this is going to need clarifying in the final wording of the Renters' Rights Bill, if the tribunal are required to actually make a determination on what the rent is going to be going forward, at the moment, the way that it's worded, that rent will not be backdated.
No.
To when the...
And it also can't be above the proposed amount.
And it can't be above the proposed amount. But so this is an interesting one here, because depending on how long these tribunals take to actually hear a case, it's possible that the landlord will not be able to increase the rent for...
So look, the rent tribunal thing is a really interesting one, because and again, back to a lot of the key conversations had at the Zoopla board the other day, what we understand is this is actually one of the key areas that is being really looked at, because the reframing, whilst making it more tenant centric, I think the general consensus is it's gone way too far, because they've removed a cost to do it. As you've said, it's not backdated, so it is a piece of legislation which, if it stays as it is now, it could over time potentially become something that tenants do as a default action, because they know it will postpone that rent increase for, let's be honest, at least a year. I remember we were talking about some statistics the other day, and I think at the moment, I think the England and Wales Rent Tribunal sees something like 400 cases a year. And I think if the legislation is implemented under the current framework, and sorry, just to touch on, those 400 or 500 cases a year at the moment take around 6 months to reach a decision on. The lowest estimate of rent tribunals, if the current framework is implemented, the lowest estimate that they've made is that at least 34,000 rent tribunals, and there is no money to fund.
There's no money to fund
the tribunal system.
Every single tenancy in the country becomes periodic. This is the point. So obviously you have a turnover.
But I'm gonna give some real world balance to this, because I think as an industry, both as letting agents and as representatives of landlords, I think it is our duty, as we are now, to flag issues with this. Now, we talk about the rent tribunal, a rent review tribunal. Now, removing a cost to a tenant, I'm actually not against that. I do think a tenant should be able to contest it without a cost. However, I disagree with removing the two current existing frameworks, which, as you say, if it is currently backdated if overthrown, so if a tenant's claim is found to be invalid. And also there have been cases, and I think this is really important. This is actually something I feel is equally as important as backdating. There have been cases where a landlord or their agent has actually offered a tenant an increase in rent but below market rate.
Right.
And that has not been appreciated or acknowledged by the tenant. They have taken it to tribunal, and the tribunal has actually sided with the landlord and has actually awarded a rent above what the landlord proposed. And I think that is really important because it is about also motivations. And that brings us into things like the bidding wars. And the rent increases. When you try and apply some kind of mandatory framework to make things fair, you won't make things more fair. You will just make people default to the highest thing. So if a landlord isn't going to be rewarded from being fair and the risk of them not getting that radically increases, guess what? Landlords won't offer fair rents. They will just go to the market and go, what does the market say I can get? Great. The market says you owe me 15% more rent. And that's what I want.
That's what will happen.
And as we also know, the bidding caps, that again is going to drive that. I don't fundamentally agree with this banning of bidding wars. It's a clumsy way to try and control how the rental market works, but you can't control demand and supply. And fundamentally, again, as we all know, the natural reaction to that will be, okay, I'm no longer allowed to accept an offer above what I market the property at. So guess what's going to happen? Everyone, or the vast majority of the market, is going to increase their prices because they're all going to take the view of, I don't possibly want to miss out on rent that I could get. So I'm just going to whack it on and then we'll let people bid down. But the unintended consequence of that is what we then create is there is already a lack of transparency in the market in terms of what a property is marketed for and what it rents for. That will continue. But what we will see is marketed rents jump 10, 15%. And where do we go for our data, for our rent reviews? The open market. And we'll be seeing inflated prices in the market, which will drive an inflated rent review process. So very frustrating. But I said I did want to bring some real world context to it. I touched on the fact there's an understanding that the rent tribunal, if implemented in its current framework, will see at least 34,000 cases. Now, I know that is backed off the data that they saw in Scotland when they implemented the similar thing, and they've kind of transposed a similar awareness. I'm intrigued. I still talk to tenants who have and I'm not talking about 18, 19-year-old tenants who are starting off. I'm talking about tenants in their 30s. Who still have zero understanding of the deposit legislation, and that is 18 years old. So as an industry, we need to be aware of poorly structured legislation. But I mean, I've also heard people basically go, oh my God, every tenant's going to do this. And I think, no, they're not. What we've got to understand about tenants is for the vast majority of tenants, understandably, all a tenant wants is the home that they want, and they want to be able to pay their rent and in return for that be left alone, have stuff fixed when it breaks down, and if they're there for a long time, occasionally have a landlord go, oh, do you know what, I'm going to pop in a new oven, I'm going to repaint that room. Tenants aren't interested. The vast majority of tenants are not out there to game the system. They're not there to rinse a landlord. Equally, but they do want a landlord or their agent to do their job. But look, we've all got busy lives. We've all got very demanding, busy lives. We're busier as people than we've ever been. So let's not lose sight of the fact that most tenants just want to be happy in their home. So there was a few things that came out.
And that actually links back to the communication point.
Yes.
Because if the agent or the landlord is actually communicating, has a good relationship with their tenant anyway, when it comes to this rent review period, be it a year, they can actually just have a sensible discussion with the tenant and say, look, Mr. Tenant, obviously it's come to the end of the year, we all have increased costs.
Yeah.
I'm going to propose a new rent. It's a reasonable.
I mean, that is, I think that's
rent.
what most reasonable landlords and letting agents do now. You know, there will be the fools who just send out a Section 13 notice with no warning or discussion at the absolute maximum they feel they can get. Yeah. And yes, those ones will result in a tribunal because people will suddenly be confronted with this very official document. Yep. Oh my God, what's a Section 13? Tenants will panic and Google it. Yeah.
How can I defend this?
And over time, and particularly with the rise of ChatGPT and Gemini and all these sort of AI tools, it would be like, oh, well, if you're a tenant, are you aware? Yeah. But look, the sensible and communicative agents and landlords out there, we know that's not how you do a rent increase. You reach out. Are you guys happy? Are you planning on, staying for the foreseeable future? Brilliant. Is there anything kind of you feel like that needs addressing at the property? Go to the landlord, diddly-dee. And then, great, landlord's happy to sort X, Y, Z. But that would be on the basis that, the rent is going to increase to this. But by the way, if we were to re-let it now, you'd be looking at Z. And you have a conversation, a bit of moderation, agreed, and the relevant paperwork goes out. And I think the sensible agents and landlords out there, again, you touched on it, communication, it all comes back to communication. Yeah. So we are fast running out of time. We are approaching an hour. We're 55 minutes in. So I want to zip through a few bits here. So there was some interesting stats around the Renters' Rights Bill. Yeah. And again, this is where I feel surveys can be quite misleading. So 27% of your tenants in the survey said that they were aware of the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, I think what's interesting is that the tenants engaging in your survey are a very unique data set of tenants. I think that's fair. There are not many tenants out there who will sit through and go through a piece of legislation. Yeah. I think whilst that's an interesting insight of those tenants, I know our experience as an agency, because for the last year, we've made a point of bringing this up on every viewing. We've made a point of saying, are you guys aware? Because very common conversations on a viewing, right, are, what's the contract terms? How long can I rent for? Will the landlord do X, Y, Z? Are there rent increases? Can I rent it for a longer term? And so we've made a point as a company on viewings and again appraisals with landlords, with our owner and resident community. We've actually been asking a lot of ours. I would say that our experience on viewings with potential residents, applicants, I'd be amazed if that's above 2 or 3%. Yeah. And the 2 or 3% who were like, yeah, I've heard of that. When you then go, okay, what is it? The general consensus is, oh, you can't kick me out anymore. A very poor understanding of what the removal of Section 21 means. So I think that's interesting.
They've probably just seen it on the BBC News or something. But of course, because it is quite a high-profile piece of legislation, and it does. I guess for people that actually do look at the news, they will have at least seen it. It's not something that's completely under the radar.
Yeah, I think interestingly, again, I think it just comes back to that thing of, we touched on deposit legislation. Tenants don't spend a lot of time educating themselves on existing law, future law, etc. And look, that's no major thing, right? As young people, we don't get out the British law book and educate ourselves on every legal right and protection that we have under British law, right? You work on that assumption that if something bad happens to me, I can kind of shout and scream and the relevant parties will come to my aid and enforce those rights. And I think that is generally the consensus of tenants. It's again, we come back to, we all have busier lives than ever. And quite frankly, just the hope is that the relevant regulations will be there, protect them when they need it. Yeah. Interestingly, around 33% of your tenants surveyed said the removal of Section 21 is the most important part of the bill. I would argue that is due to a massive lack of understanding of what the changes actually are, as we touched on earlier. And I think there has been some massively misleading media kind of puff pieces, again, by the likes of Shelter and Acorn and other tenant rights groups, championing this as this incredible change within the PRS. Yeah. But as we touched on earlier, I don't think actually there's going to be any change. And I think actually there's going to be a negative impact to some tenants. And also even touching on landlords who try to sell. You know, we did touch on earlier the fact that the 4 months notice and the blocker of being able to relet for a year will discourage the kind of tire kicker landlords. Yeah, fair enough. Although the argument would be a lot of those tire kicker landlords won't sell anyway. And whilst it's an inconvenience for the tenants to have some viewings, it's not the end of the world. The landlords that are serious about selling, now, we run a lettings only operation, but we've got clients selling. We currently run, tapping my microphone again. We currently run a very open dialogue around what's happening. We talk to our residents really early on in the process about what our owner's intention is for the property, what that looks like. So we give our residents an understanding about, you know, because again, I think there's this perception that you put a property to market, it's going to be like 200 people walking through your front door. The reality is, if it's a quality agent, you shouldn't really have more than 20 or 30 viewings on a property to get it sold, because it's about walking the right people through the door. And then we explain most of our properties are leasehold, so the sales process you're looking at really 6 months from offer to completion. And we navigate that process where we will typically keep a tenant on a rolling contract basis. We will get through the early stage of a sale, so we will get it, if there's a mortgage, we will get it through like the valuation / mortgage, the proper mortgage offer. And we will get kind of the very, very early basic due diligence done. Like we might get local search results back, and if they're having a proper full survey done, that report back. But really, the moment we get to that stage, which is typically about a month into the sale, 2 months tops, that's the point where we're like, right, guys, now's about the right time for us to serve our 2 months notice. You know, we'll often say to the tenants that it doesn't mean you have to leave in 2 months. But we're putting that there so it's there. We'll continue to communicate with you, and in most cases we track the sale and the tenancy to the point where the tenant is able to stay very close to up to complete exchange of contracts.
Will you try and find another property for those tenants as well?
Yeah. I mean, if they want to move within our portfolio, we try and support them generally. We'll also make sure that there's kind of proactive framework as well, where we'll get again looking at how the tenancy's gone to date. But vast majority of our tenants, we have a very good relationship with. Our periodic inspections show that the property's well cared for, and so again, with that harmonious relationship, we'll often approach a landlord and go, look, why don't we say to the tenants that we guarantee to release their deposit within 2 days of them leaving the property? I've even had a couple of landlords go, do you know what? Let's, once they've signed a tenancy agreement on a new property and they provide a copy, I'm happy to release the deposit now.
Okay,
nice. So we've even had landlords be more proactive because they understand it. And it's all about that give and take. But I think, again, when we look at the new framework, I kind of understand the increased notice. I kind of understand the 1 year ban on reletting. I understand the intention behind it.
That's just to provide a bit of teeth.
It's to provide a bit of teeth so landlords don't leverage it.
Using that as a...
But there's not many landlords. I referred to the tire kicker landlord. There's not a lot of landlords out there who just for shits and giggles put their property on the market every year. And the trouble is, by making it 4 months, like I said, I explained we would track it and get it to a viable point. You're not going to be able to do that anymore, because if you've got a tenant who is insistent on the full notice, 4 months notice is too long. You're not going to be able to get exchange ready and then wait 4 months, because if there's a mortgage offer involved, the mortgage offer is going to expire. That's if you've got a buyer who is willing to sit on their hands on a sale that is now going to take potentially 10 months to get through.
Actually, something I need to check is how long that notice can be used for. So say once you actually serve the 4-month notice, how long afterwards before that expires? So obviously the 4 months is the shortest period.
This is it. But then having served
what happens after that?
Yeah. So there's questions.
You might get landlords. We'll have to wait and see, because you never can predict exactly what behaviour is going to happen after these things. But you might get landlords that actually serve the notice for the 4 months, and then they actually gives them a year maybe to decide to sell.
Yeah, maybe. But then
let's wait and see.
But then that year's ban. I mean, I get it. I get it that you're trying to make sure landlords aren't desensitized for kind of gaming the system to kick out a tenant to get it back. But what? Again, like who is this landlord gaming the system to get a tenant out, and for what mysterious reason that isn't covered by other clauses? And I would argue that if that sale falls through due to whatever reason, but more often than not, it's got nothing to do with the seller. It's usually to do with the buyer or their lender. You are now going to be presented with someone with no income on a property. Who is not allowed to put it back into the PRS.
Also, 4 months is a long time in the world of property. Like anything can happen to the market.
Yes.
Like interest rates could go crazy. These tariffs could all cause economic chaos. Like who knows what's going to happen? So it's, for the landlord to then not be able to put the property back on the market is that a restriction on trade? I mean, there could be other human rights type arguments that come off the back of this once NRLA and other organisations start digging a bit deeper into it.
So I'm going to skim over. We've gone over an hour, so I'm just going to skim over some other things. And I think I don't think we're going to have time to discuss these. So I'm just going to throw out some interesting stats just for people to think about, and be really interesting to hear people's thoughts on some of this. So one thing I found really interesting: 77% of landlords and 85% of agents are aware of the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, I mean, frankly, I find both of those statistics terrifying for the fact that
100
exactly, that figure is not 95 to 100%, particularly on agents.
Well, and also particularly because they are members of a Hamilton Fraser scheme, and we pump out a lot of.
So we're talking about just, and then you then go on. 24% of landlords and 15% of those agents who are aware are not aware of the provisions within the Renters' Rights Bill. So what we're saying is, there are 15% of agents out there who literally have heard of something called the Renters' Rights Bill, but have no knowledge of that. Make that what you will. If you're one of those 15%, do something about it. There's a lot of information resources out there. There's a lot of supplier partners that are putting stuff out there. I know you guys have got a lot of stuff through Landlord Zone, Fix Flow, Good Lord, Property Mark. There are a lot of channels putting out some really digestible stuff out there. Don't feel overwhelmed by it, but Jesus Christ, don't ignore it. It's coming. And if you're worried about the impact it's going to have on your business, it's going to have a much bloody bigger impact on your business if you don't understand what's coming and you're not prepared for it. So stop being afraid, start educating yourself. And again, also talk to agent mates. We've done a lot of bouncing ideas and challenges and thoughts around stuff with agent friends. What else have we got here? 7.7% of agents worried about tenants being able to challenge rent increases. I mean, we kind of touched on that. Look, I think legitimately, bottom line is make sure you're proposing and justifying your rents. Have a conversation. Comes back to this recurring theme throughout our chat. Communicate. Some of the things. A third of landlords saying they're struggling to find reliable tenants. Interesting. Why is that? I would argue also that's a really interesting message for letting agents out there. Interestingly, like rent arrears is a very small concern for landlords. I think it was somewhere around like 5%, I seem to recall. But if you see a third are worried about reliable tenants, what are the tenants you like place? How reliable are they? How nice are they to get on? What are your rent arrears figures and statistics around the tenants that you comprehensively reference? Because I would argue that is a really important message to be putting out into your local landlord community. We touched on, and again, the stats, I suppose they surprise me a little bit on the size. You touch a little bit on the kind of deposit alternative space. Only 2.4% of tenancies have an alternative deposit product on them, which is surprisingly low given the maturity of the market. Around 30%, which is interesting, because about 30% of tenants saying raising the money for moving in is one of their biggest challenges. Slightly, and again, 2.4%, quite low, bearing in mind you reported over 15% of letting agents and landlords do or have offered those products. So interestingly, but then, we've got stuff, 60% of tenants feel settled in their home. 64% of tenants feel secure or very secure. Brilliant. 8.7% are considering leaving. That will largely be because of job, life circumstance, or they're trying to buy. No, that was 8.7%. So, combining those figures, 73% are either secure, very secure, or are choosing to leave of their own volition. Now, some worrying ones. Approximately 10% of the tenants surveyed are spending more than 71% of their income on rent. That is a concern. I don't know what we can do about that. I think that loops back
to supply and demand issue.
It's a supply and demand issue, and that loops back to landlords struggling to find reliable tenants. So again, it's a really important education piece for agents at the moment about what is a reliable tenant, how do you establish affordability, what are the other factors you look at, and what do you do to kind of ring fence the viability of them as a tenant. So again, we touched on this before, personal guarantors, professional guarantors, or rent and legal expense warranties. I think that's probably oh, and then this was just satisfaction with the properties, people's satisfaction with their homes. 45%, the biggest section was 45%, which is quite satisfied.
People's general
Slightly
view.
disappointing. 27.7% very satisfied. I mean, that's good. Over 1 in 4 tenants are very satisfied with their home. On the contrast, 20% are kind of moderately dissatisfied or not particularly satisfied with their home. And then obviously 6.3% are very unsatisfied. Now, that is still something to look at. 6% of the PRS, we're looking at in excess of 250,000 homes. So it's not a small number. I would argue that shows that things like property licensing isn't working. And I think that is a topic for another day. After an hour and 10, we definitely don't have time to start on property licensing.
Why they're is it a condition with the property? Is it the rent's too high? Do they not get on with their landlord? Do they not get on with their co-tenants?
Yeah.
There's various reasons why people might be very unhappy, but again, and that's probably, what was it, 6.3%?
6.3%. So it works out over 250,000 homes. Obviously that wasn't your data pool, but expanded, applicable for the PRS. And then I think an interesting thing for landlords and agents to think about is in your survey, 17% of tenants surveyed have no aspirations to buy. Now, whether that's because they feel they will never be able to, or they are just happy with the renting model, that number is going to keep growing, is my firm belief. That number is going to keep edging. It's not going to grow dramatically, but year by year, on the basis that the cost of property and the cost of rent doesn't dramatically reverse, that number is going to keep creeping up. I don't know if landlords think in these terms. I think big, larger portfolio landlords will, but I think particularly letting agents, what are you doing to engage with this kind of new community or today's community of lifelong renters? Because that default attitude of, it's only renting, you're only a tenant,
it's changing.
that has got to change. And you know, how are you going to wrap your service around these long-term tenants? Because I think, Tim, you brought it up earlier and we were talking about selling and, you know, you've got a nice tenant, you're trying to bounce them into another one of your properties. Absolutely, this is what you've got to be thinking about. Yeah. And with the Renters' Rights Bill coming in, indefinite but periodic tenancies.
Properly treating that tenant as a customer.
Yeah.
Like having a full range of services for that person who's likely to be a customer for a longer period of time than
and making them feel valued. I mean, if you've got a fantastic tenant who's lovely to deal with, pays their rent early, you know, which the good ones often do, pays their rent early or, you know, on time, looks after that property, you know, makes reasonable requests, is moderate when it comes to their expectations on repairs and timeframes, etc. My God, why wouldn't you want to keep that tenant or residents, as we like to call them, within your business? Because that is almost as good an asset as your landlord. Yes, your landlord is going to be paying your bills at the end of the day, but having the easiest possible journey and providing that landlord with the best possible resident, isn't that really how we win as letting agents? So look, my God, this is the longest chat so far. We smashed out an hour and a quarter.
Cut this a little bit.
Triss's brain is going to break, triggering out how to edit this. But look, we've touched on the really interesting points. Tim, thanks for coming down.
Pleasure to chat it through, actually, and go into it in this much detail.
Yeah, it's been fun. I mean, there's a lot more we could have talked about. So do go and check out the report for yourself. I think actually what we'll try and make sure we do when we put these live, we'll share a link to the report within the comments or within the articles to make sure that you guys can easily access that. Be really interested to hear some of your thoughts on what we've talked about today. Does some of the stats and data that we've used, does that align with what you see in your business? Does that surprise you? Is it considerably different in your business? Why? And how are you tackling some of the things we've talked about? But Tim, been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Talk soon.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.